Welcome, everybody. I am Jess Rogers. I'm from Explore and Soar Occupational Therapy, and Andrea Cooper is also with us today from Andrea Cooper Speech Pathology. We first got together when we were meeting each other at all of the schools doing transition to school kindergarten orientation programs throughout the Hunter. And so we decided that whilst everything is up in the air for the remainder of this year, that we would bring it online and provide this opportunity for you guys a little bit earlier than term 4, just because we don't know what next term is going to do for the rest of the year and as we transition our kids into kindergarten. So we are here tonight to share this information with you all. If you have a look in the chat section, you'll see some resources that we have already put in there that you can use for your reference and just as a guide for additional strategies to use over the course of the next few months and things to look out for as you're preparing the kids to transition to school. Any questions that you have throughout the night, feel free to put it into the chat bar. We will be going through the questions at the end once we both finish, and we will then open it up to you if you have any additional questions as well. I think that's all from my end. If there's any other housekeeping that I've forgotten, Andrea?
More than we're happy for you guys to have your cameras on during the presentation. We will ask you just to put yourselves on mute though until question time at the end.
Beautiful.
Okay, let's go. So thank you everybody for coming along to tonight's presentation. We're going to start with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, seas and waters throughout Australia and pay respect to elders past, present and future. We recognise that the health, social and emotional well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are grounded in continued connection to culture, country, language and community. And today I'm coming from a Wabikal lands. It's very wet outside, so feel free to also share in the chat which lands you're coming from to join us tonight in our presentation. To start off with school readiness, we're going to be focusing on transition and giving some tips as well as a list of those expected milestones for any children starting kindergarten. But we do hear this school readiness term used in lots of different settings. What it refers to is whether a child is ready to make an easy and successful transition into primary school. Many skills do contribute to school readiness and can affect a child's readiness to learn. Often we quickly think of the academic skills, but there are other skills which are just as or more important for a child to have before starting school, such as their emotional, social, language, self-care and motor skills. And Jess and I will be talking about these ones in particular. And I think what's really important about school readiness and why we're presenting to you tonight, there's some good research out there that does show a child's school readiness skills and the success they have in the early years of school does set them up later on for future academic success. So as Jess said, my name is Andrea and I'm a speech pathologist. I offer services. I've got a team of speeches and we travel with Cessnock, Singleton, Maitland, Newcastle, mostly the Hunter Valley region. So you may have seen us pop up, providing home, school and preschool visits and at the moment telehealth. I guess, what does a speech pathologist do? I really hate the term speech pathologist because I think it doesn't really express all the areas within our scope of practice. So, going into that a little bit further for you, of course, the speech pathologist works on speech sounds, so the articulation, how we make sounds, and looking at, a child or adult's ability to, be understood with their communication skills. Expressive language, that really refers to the vocabulary, the grammatical structures, the sentence structures, and how you piece together words to express a message. We then have the receptive language skills, and that looks at your understanding, your ability to follow directions, comprehend information, as well as you're looking at multiple text types and how you understand and then reuse that information in an expressive language. We have social skills. So of course, the language that we're able to understand and express, we want them to be able to use, and that occurs in social context. So a speech pathologist does work in the area of social skills, learning what the conversation rules, taking turns, as well as how to introduce new topics of conversation when they might need to be changed, and acknowledging the non-verbal forms of communication and what somebody might be trying to express. You will find there's a lot of crossover when it comes to the social skills from an OT lens, psychology lens, communication lens. There seems to be lots of collaboration around the social skills, pragmatic language, as we would call it. A speech pathologist works in the area of voice. So this will include children who might have extreme loudness or softness with their voice, husky voice qualities. We work with adults who might be having some difficulties with their voice, in particular teachers who often lose their voice quite easily as throughout periods of the year. So that's an area that a speech pathologist can help with. The literacy skills, this is a particular area of interest of mine. Of course, sounds that we are learning and saying. We then can also practice and putting them down on paper, so communication. It comes under speech pathology, and in particular those early literacy skills, which I'll be talking about later on. Fluency, that refers to stuttering. So how fluent somebody's speech is. Are they having multiple breaks in their speech? Does it sound disjointed? A speech pathologist works to remediate stuttering. And then we have the technology. So that refers to other means to communicate, whether that be sign language or having a device that might communicate for you. So a speech pathologist works in programming those devices and working out which vocabulary selections that would be appropriate for that person to have access to. Now on to school readiness. So the first part of my presentation is really going to focus on skills that we would assume a child would have before starting kindergarten. I just want to make a point here though. It's really important to be mindful that children do develop these skills on a continuum. They won't all just suddenly turn 5 and be able to produce particular sounds. We do find that some children develop skills a lot earlier than what others do. In particular, girls tend to be a little bit earlier with developing some of those language and social skills, whereas the boys tend to do better with like some of the problem-solving math space. Obviously, that's a generalization, but that is what the research does tell us. When I'm talking through this, just be mindful that if your child isn't able to do all of these things, it doesn't mean they're going to be unsuccessful starting school, but I have some tips later on as to ways that you can actually promote and encourage those skills. So the first section is speech. Now this refers obviously to the speech sounds and how intelligible the child is to both familiar and unfamiliar people. Now, by the age of 5, starting kindergarten, children should be able to say practically all sounds. There may be some that they're having difficulty with. For example, the TH sound, thumb, often is pronounced as a thumb. So free might sound like free. We also find some difficulties around that sound. So red might sound like wed. And sometimes there's a little bit of a lisp that might sneak through as well. And if your child does have a lisp, we really want to investigate what type. So there's an interdental lisp where the tongue comes between the teeth, like sun instead of sun. Or there's a lateral lisp, which is where it sounds very slushy, almost like there's marbles in the mouth. That type of lisp is one that doesn't tend to remediate, fix itself over time. You would need a speech pathologist for that particular sound. Otherwise, if they just got the sound, I wouldn't be too worried. It's really about emphasizing how to make that sound, and hopefully it'll develop usually by the age of between 6 and 8 is when we see that sound being able to be produced correctly. Overall though, children should be 100% intelligible. We're both familiar and unfamiliar people. So this means when we're allowed to go out and about, if they start having a conversation with another child in the park, the other child should be able to understand what they're talking about. It doesn't mean they get every single sound correct, but their message is able to be understood. We then have fluency. And as I said before, fluency does relate to stuttering. So by the age of 5, we should have no stuttering occurring. That could be at the start of a word, like mum. It could be whole word repetitions, like, oh, let's go to the car. what we want to be seeing is nice fluent speech. If a child is stuttering at this age before commencing kindergarten, highly recommend speech pathology. There is some lovely research and programs out there to suggest that early intervention can actually cure a stutter. Whereas if it persists past the age of 7, it is much harder for us to remediate long term, and it's more about giving that child skills to being able to maintain and know what to do in the case that they do stutter. So early intervention for stuttering is highly recommended. The next part we have is receptive language. So receptive language refers to the understanding. So by the age of 5, we're really looking for children to be able to follow 3-step instructions in order. Now that might sound like a lot, but it'd be really interesting to see at home, I guess, what your instructions look like. And often, put your hat in your bag, get out your lunch and sit on the floor is a really common one we hear at school. Another point about the types of instructions used in the school environment are conditional concepts. So like the word if. Now, what I often find is kids may listen to the last part of the instruction, but might miss out on that first word if. If that's the case, it's really important that we emphasize that particular word. So what I mean by a type of question that kindergartners might be exposed to, if you've finished reading the book, come and sit on the floor. Now, for a child who's not understanding that if, they're just going to sit on the floor, whether or not they've heard, or understood what if means. So at home, think about incorporating the word if into your instructions. And I like to play a little language game. So, if it is raining outside, clap your hands. And, doing one that has a negative. So, if it's daytime, clap your hands. And if they're clapping their hands, you can talk about what that word if means and have a bit of a play with it. We want children to be able to understand concepts such as big, little, tiny, quantity concepts, all except one, comparatives, what things are same versus what are different. We want them to know the position words, prepositions, be able to explain where things are, but also follow instructions. Oh, can you please put the book beside, the bed? We want children to be able to recognize and group objects. So this is really important for that vocabulary knowledge. Bee and a horse are both animals, but can they also then tell me how they're different? A bee has wings, horse has 4 legs. We want children to be able to identify objects by group or function, so telling me that scissors are used for cutting. We want them to be able to listen to stories and being able to answer various WH and how questions. So you're going to have a bit of a hierarchy. Some questions are going to be easier. For example, what is the girl doing? Versus what do you think is going to happen next? Or what would you do if you were in that situation? We want children to have good sequencing, so being able to understand first and last and put things in particular order. Expressive language. This is the form of language that we actually produce to express a message. So we want children to be able to have quite a large range of vocabulary words, with different topics. As much as I love Paw Patrol, and it's really good that they can name all the Paw Patrol characters for their own stories, it's really important that they have other vocabulary words as well, particularly the verbs and action words. We want children to be able to speak in full sentences, which are mostly grammatically correct. However, it is important to note at this age, you are going to have some difficulty with grammar forms that are complex. For example, we say ED for past tense, like jumped, but when it's eat, the word changes to ate rather than eated. And that can be quite confusing for this age group. So what I would recommend if you hear one of those grammatical errors, the girl eated the apple, we can then recast it and just model that correction. The girl ate the apple. We don't have to say you're wrong, but just by modeling and emphasizing that word and pausing and giving that child an opportunity to then repeat it, that is a really good way to work on improving their grammatical forms. Of course, at school, they're going to get lots of practice of learning how these words changes and what these rules are. We want children to be able to use pronouns correctly. And what's interesting is that depending upon their gender, I find the kids have a bit of a preference for pronouns if they're not fully correct yet. So some of my little boys that I say everything's he or him, they seem to forget about the female pronouns. And again, what we would do, just like I said with the tense, we're going to recast that, that the phrase that they said incorrect and just say a correct version for it. So, remodeling the word that they should have said. We want children to be able to use joining words, those conjunctions, to join their sentences and ideas together to show causation. We want them to be able to tell stories with all of the parts. They don't have to be very detailed, long stories, even if they're short stories. And this really relates to being able to then explain to you, that when they're coming home, what they did in the day. So, whether it's a favorite book or a favorite movie or an activity that you've done together, practicing, what did you do? Tell me, what did we start with? What was in the middle and what was at the end of the story can be really helpful to build their expressive language skills. And of course, we're starting to move into the social skills now. We want them to be able to maintain conversations with peers and adults. And we're looking for several turns, both asking questions and making comments about what's happening in that conversation, what the topic might be. Our social skills, so pragmatic language, the way we use language to communicate with others. We want children to be able to take turns when requested, play cooperatively with each other, start to problem solve some of those difficulties that do arise when we're playing with peers, give and maintain eye contact with each other, interact easily with other children, and complete tasks with attention and minimal support. Listening skills. Now, this is a really interesting one. So listening skills are essential for the school, starting school. What's interesting though is often it's the first school term where listening skills are worked on. So if your child can't sit and listen for an extended period of time, don't stress. You can definitely engage with an OT, speechy from a language point of view, audiologist if needed, just to check, make sure that hearing is okay. But the first term of kindy I find is often working on listening skills, being able to sit on the floor together as a group. For some children, they may never have been exposed to that before. So it is an important skill, and you can practice some listening games, and I'll get to that a little bit later on. But the interesting point about listening is that on average, teachers do ask a lot of questions. 300 to 400 questions per day, in fact. So 40% of a teacher's talk time is spent asking and responding to questions. What's interesting is 50 to 60% of the students' talk time is actually responding to questions. So rather than, coming up with their own ideas and making comments, a lot of it is actually that comprehension component. And generally, teachers only wait less than 1 second for a response. So listening skills are really important so the child's able to identify those 300 to 400 questions, but also practice comprehending and being able to answer a range of different questions and trying to reduce how long it takes for your child to generate a response. Now we have early literacy skills. So often we start with the speech sounds, and we want to make sure there's a connection there between the speech form and then also the written form. But there's some steps in between that we usually work on to get there. So children starting school can usually recognise their own name and are starting to learn to write it. We want children to be able to understand the single sounds and being able to segment those sounds and identify which ones are the same and which ones sound different. So, for example, p and per sound the same, but b and per are different. We want children to be able to link some of the letters and sounds that they represent. I find kids are particularly good with the letters in their name. What's really tricky, though, is that unfortunately, with the English language, 1 or 2 letters doesn't always represent the same sound. So what I mean by that is the letters SH obviously make 1 sh sound, but on their own individually make a s and h. So that can be a little bit tricky, but again, that's something that they're going to focus on at school. If it is in your child's name, though, I would be practicing saying the letters in your name. So if it's Shane, S-H-A-N-E, but also practicing breaking up. So it's a sh, a, n, which has 3 sounds. We want children to identify words that rhyme. And there's some really good books, I'm sure you're all familiar with Dr. Seuss, that rely on rhyming and getting the child to see if they can come up with their own word, even if it's a nonsense made up word. We want children to be able to turn the pages of a book independently and also know that a story is read left to right. So we turn the pages one way and identify that those little symbols there, that represents a word. They don't have to, don't have to read the word at this stage, but just recognizing some familiar text and showing an interest is really important. Okay, next we have my favorite part, the tips. So we've gone through like the milestones. What are some of the things that I'm looking out for when a child is starting kindergarten to make sure they've got those skills that will hopefully lead to that success later on in the academic years. But this is the part where it's like, okay, what can we do to build those skills? I think the main thing to start with is about conversation. We want to expose children to lots of different words and give them an opportunity to expand upon their own vocabulary they're using, but also show like an increased understanding. A really good way to do this is to have more conversation. Turn the TV off during dinner or when you're in the car, talk about the different things that you can see. We want to share experiences with the children and ask them questions that can help structure their own story. We want to add new vocabulary to the conversation and talk about what these words mean, telling jokes or commenting on how or what people say. And my favorite ones that I would say, don't steer clear from, let's talk about them, is the figurative language. Often we use idioms, sayings, expressions, but it can be really confusing for a child who doesn't know the meaning of those. So it's raining cats and dogs out there. I've got some littlies who I see who would take that very literally and wonder why Andrea is crazy thinking there's cats and dogs falling from the sky. So I think in that instance, it's really important that we talk about the expression, oh, it actually means that it's just raining really, really heavy. But think about adding some of those jokes and idioms into your conversations and see if they can start to use them as well. Again, grammar, that's really important. Often what a child says is what they'll then write later on. So we really need to correct the grammatical and sentence structure forms in oral speech before we expect them to be able to write correctly. So for example, if we heard her take my toy, we're going to recast, oh, she took your toy, and really just emphasize the way we've changed those words. We could then, prompt a little bit later on, oh, can you say she took your toy? If we really want to make sure that they're able to produce that structure. However, it's not always essential. We need to balance that because sometimes our littlies can shut down if they're constantly being corrected. So it's just about reading your child and working out what feedback they take to. We want to expand your child's sentences. So we want to explain what those new words mean, especially those connecting words, and show how they're used. So if your child said the boy is crying, you want to go, yes, the boy is crying because the dog ran away with his ball, and show how that word does connect those two sentences and those ideas. We want to start asking open-ended questions and various questions. And following this presentation, Jess and I will be sending you through the little handouts, plus I have an extra little sheet for you, which goes through the hierarchy of questions and which ones are the different levels and what to ask. And it's really nice to have that beside you as you're reading through different stories or different play experiences at home, just to test out and see, I guess, which ones that they have better accuracy with. We want to explain how words are connected and also explain how they're different. That's really important for vocabulary knowledge. And then, moving on to higher, more complex forms of being able to say, well, another word for little is tiny. We want to practice listening games. Now, Simon Says, that's a really good one, which is about conditional, where they're listening for that particular Simon Says. We want to ask your child to maybe listen to a particular word in the story. And one of my favorites is the book Wombat Stew. And every time the dingo is doing something very naughty and trying to convince the wombat to get in the stew, we might do the little dingo ears every time we hear that word dingo. So thinking about maybe changing particular words in a familiar nursery rhyme, a song, and a story, just to see if the child is able to recognise, oh, hang on, mum or dad, you've just changed that, you got that wrong. So that's a really nice way to build in some listening skills. And as I said previously, we really want to start testing how they follow instructions, using concepts such as if, before, and after. And one of my little tips would be to practice lining up. So maybe you line up at the door before you go outside to have a bit of a play. And if you've got multiple kids, fantastic. You can use them to practice who's first, who's last, who's in the middle. If not, maybe we can line up the teddies and reenact what that might look like in the school environment. And that leads to, I guess, more pretend games. There's going to be lots of new experiences for your child starting big school next year. So we want to, kind of set them up for success and know what they're in for. We're not too sure what orientation is going to look like this year, next term, but be assured that schools really recognise how important this orientation time is. And in that case, they will be, prioritising having your little one come in. But the more you can do at home, the better. We want to pretend to buy food from the canteen, pretend to borrow books from the library, pretend to visit sick bay. And we could create a sick bay for the teddies, for lining up. So, lots of different experiences. You might even have like a little desk and you can practice, some recognizing the name and those style of activities. Most importantly, in play as well. So maybe all the teddies can go to school for the day. We want to involve children in activities beyond the immediate family. Now, I know this is very hard at the moment, so fingers crossed we're able to, explore the outside world sooner. And, going to the park, talking about the different things that you can see is just going to expose your child to lots of different words, and they can test out some of their sentences. And we want to drive by the school regularly if we can and point out and talk about how exciting it will be when they grow there. We want to dress up in the school uniform if we can. And this is, I guess, very related to Jess's area in terms of, making sure the uniform fits well and the sensitivities around that. And she'll talk about that further on. But from the language perspective, by talking about what to expect and who else is going to be there is really important. In terms of the early literacy skills, I love being able to break up words into single sounds or playing I Spy games with the sound focus and not the letters. And this is going to make, that game a lot more accessible to our younger kids who may not be, or, proficient spellers. That's going to happen at school where they learn those skills. So, I'm thinking of something starting with a sound. Oh, it's muffin. Thinking about the sounds that, the start of words rather than their letters is really important. We want to practice alliteration and tongue twister games. So ants on the apple, trying to think about what sounds are at the start. We want to practice how many syllables or beats are in your child's name, clapping those out. So Andrea, we've got 3. And let's say multiple words around home and see how many else in that 3 category or 2 syllable category. We want to discuss the meanings of new and unusual words. And this is really important as you're reading a book. Maybe there's a new word that you haven't seen before and we can point that one out. And what do you think that word means? Strange. And then think about the child being able to then use that sentence or that word in a sentence of their own. We want to read familiar stories, and this is really to give your child the confidence to then be able to retell or act out the story, and you can listen for the sequencing and how long their sentences are. It's going to set them up for success. I love talking about books, particularly what's on the picture. So don't feel like you need to stick to the script of what the text says. You can talk about the pictures, ask lots of different questions, and then give your child the opportunity to point out things and make comments for themselves. We want to play word and listening games. What's the first word you think of when I say? And again, that's another little vocabulary activity that you can build in and great for the car. We want to make a time to read to your child every day. If anything, I think this is my number one tip. Reading books or watching little videos on YouTube together, anything where you're with your child and you're experiencing that time and talking about different experiences together is important. With a book or these little YouTube videos, it exposes a child to language, words that are typically not part of their everyday. So what I mean by that is if you opened up a book about space, you're going to learn about planets, aliens, astronauts. You're not typically using those words at bath time or dinner time. So think about exposing your child to different books and stories because it's going to really broaden their vocabulary and, of course, their imagination, which leads to reading a variety of books. And a book does not have to be one that you open. It can be the ones on the iPads. It could be, as I said, short little films. It could be nursery ones. It could be even a catalogue from for the shopping. And you can talk about the different items and what they're used for. We want to ask questions that probe understanding. So looking at what was the main problem with the story? Why did that person do that? What would you have done in that instance? Here's just a few of my favorite books for starting kindergarten, and I'm going to be sharing this list with you. These books, have little stories about starting school and can be a really nice way just to engage your child and, get them used to some of the things that they may experience on those first few days of school. There's some little funny stories there as well that you can have a bit of a laugh at. And you can kind of use those books, at the end of the school day as well to go, well, did you do any of these things? I guess ultimately we need to remember that school is all about learning. It's okay if your child cannot do all of these things quite yet. We really want to just expose the children to these areas as discussed, because they're going to have a greater success when they do start at school. It's important to talk to your child's teacher, preschool teacher, educator, if it's daycare, about what they're doing to support their transition to school. And, I think a really nice tip is to talk to your child's school, connect with other families and children who may also be going there. And, when the time comes, if we can look at organising some play dates, just so that your child has someone familiar for when they do start. If you do have any concerns, of course, this is a perfect time to engage with a speech pathologist or OT, particularly around the speech and language, because we do have, a few months before we can, before we need to start school. And we can definitely give you some tips of some things you can be working on specifically for your child at home. I'll pass it over to Jess.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Andrea. Loved it. So in amongst with speech, there's also so many different components of speech and language, which is awesome. And then we also have the OT side of things. From my perspective, from Explore and Soar, we work mobile. We're a mobile company, so we go anywhere from Newcastle through to Muswellbrook and Scone. So hi from everywhere today. With OT, I guess the broad overview of occupational therapy is really anything that you do in your daily life that is meaningful to you. And it's broken down into multiple areas, from self-care to then school and play through learning, and then work as we become adults, and then leisure. So from our perspective, it's really about developing confidence, skills, and well-being in all aspects of our life. And we work from 3 different areas. So we're looking at working with a child or the individual around developing those skills so they're independent. We are then also going to look at the environment and where they're completing their everyday activities, and what we need to do to adapt and to alter it so it is successful for them. And then if there's also not that, then we also bring in adaptive equipment. So we come from 3 different views when we're looking at skill development, but primarily we're going to look at how can we make and support everybody to do it independently to start with. When we're transitioning to school, we're looking at a multitude of areas. So you can see here we've got self-care to transitions to sensory processing, emotional regulation, social, gross fine motor, and just overall interaction. So we're going to go through all of these today briefly. You will get a copy of these slides, so you have this as a reference point, and then we've got all the additional strategies and activities to support in each of these areas in the handout, just in the chat. So don't forget that. Any questions around these though, we'll talk about that at the end. So don't be afraid to write it down and send it through as well. So I guess one of the biggest things is self-care, and that's a part of the biggest transition for our children, is ensuring that they can dress themselves, that they can do every daily living activity by this time to assist with the transition into school. And I guess one of the biggest things to get right or to work on most is sleep, and really establishing a strong sleep routine as we're transitioning to school. One of my greatest strategies and ways to do it is working and slowly shifting the sleep routine for a couple of weeks prior to transitioning to school. That way you're adjusting, because I know it's always a big adjustment as we're transitioning back to school after 6 weeks or more off, and then being able to get up and to establish a normal routine that is going to fit for your family. If this is your first child, you'll be establishing that for the first time as you're transitioning to kindergarten. If you have some older children, then you've already got a routine and they've already got a bit of an idea. So it's incorporating and teaching them how that routine will fit for them, and what they need to be thinking about now. I guess some other things to look at is, what will they be taking to school? So different food and packaging. Can the children open them? Are they familiar with it? When you purchase their new drink bottles and their lunch boxes, can they open and close them as well? So it's really just practicing those skills so they are familiar, as well as any cutlery if they take it with them. Dressing is a big one initially, especially with with this school uniform. Sometimes feels a little bit different. You've got smaller buttons, or zippers that are hard to use, and sometimes it's also the shoelaces, depending on what type of shoes you purchase. So it's really developing that body awareness and supporting them in feeling comfortable and familiar in the school uniform, almost like working it in. I'm not using the right analogy right now, apologies, but just so they're feeling comfortable, so when they do get to school, it's not as stressful and overwhelming, whilst it doesn't seem like all the seams are different than what they're used to. That is one of the biggest things I know some of our children find quite challenging, is that adjustment. Sometimes it's seams in the socks. That could be the trigger, or just it's the irritating thing, depending on what kind of socks you get. So if you get to iron all those creases out before you transition to school, then that's really going to support you. We also then have the toileting side of things. And this, for us, everybody has their own routine when they develop an independence for toileting. So it's really establishing and working on where they're at and making them feel comfortable. For them, it may or may not be going into a cubicle and knowing that sequence and the new process of toileting in a school and what that means. And I know, for us, one of my clients had an incident because he's got younger siblings, and he went into a cubicle with a friend, and it was about, helping him. So is your children independent in being able to toilet and do all of the appropriate skills, like wiping themselves if they need to? So how do you navigate that to support that transition so they are independent? So it's just asking all those questions and supporting them. We then transitioning, routines, morning, evening. They're all big things for our children, and can be quite anxiety provoking because it's new, it's uncertain, especially for the first few weeks. So if you have that time, and if you have that routine of a morning and an evening that you can set clear expectations, use visuals or use words or predictability, to ensure that they know what to expect as they transition in, will help ease some of their nerves. It can be helpful, like Andrea said, to drive past the school and to talk about it, but also to talk about what happens if your mornings and evenings are different. Sometimes you have families who do shift work. So, mornings and evenings are going to be different. People are going to be picking up, dropping off at different times, or catching the bus first being picked up. So really talking through what the expectations are for them, and knowing what days they happen on a visual calendar will really help them transition in smoothly when they're already so nervous about what it's going to be, or their new friends and everything else that's going on. Transitions and routines can be quite complex, and it's individual for all of you. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and we can break that down further. Cool. Sensory processing. This is kind of the can worms. Where do we start? Basically, we all have our own individual ways of processing sensory input. We all have our own 8 sensory systems that are developing in utero and continue to develop post-birth. Everybody is individualized. You have your own way of processing it, the own way you sort, filter, and organize it in your body to then have an appropriate response in the environment. So for us, from a sensory processing perspective, it is something that I highly recommend if you have anything or any concerns around for your child in being able to attend or concentrate or process sounds or move or however it is that's going on for you guys, just contact an OT around supporting that. Otherwise, my biggest thing is playing on it, knowing your children, you are their health professionals, you know them inside and out. So having a bit of a play on what their bodies need to help them feel good so they are ready to learn is a really great way to kind of understand what they're going to need. So then you can talk to the teachers about it. But outside of that, it's very much individualized. So have a chat to us. From, I guess, the one-off tip that we do have, proprioception is pressure through joints, ligaments, and muscles. The biggest strategy you will see around, and that is talked about, is heavy work. And that's because it's movement with resistance. And it is proprioception is the only sensory system when you provide heavy work that is calming and that regulates the body to feel good, but is also alerting and keeps you awake and engaged. So if anything, biggest strategy is heavy work that's going to suit your child in any form of movement with resistance will really help support attention and engagement in activities. Beautiful. Then we have emotional regulation. So the sensory systems really support your ability to then regulate your emotions, because it's how you're feeling internally inside your body, and it's also how you are interpreting and responding to the world outside of you. And so what that means is, from the sensory systems, we have all this information, and then we have to understand it to then regulate our emotions. How it's done from when we're born is we have co-regulation through parents, caregivers around touch and movement and rocking that's really calming and soothing. And that is co-regulation. Co-regulation is the foundation to any form of self-regulation. So you can see here that it is secondary self-regulation, and that is one's ability to understand what they need and how to calm themselves. So you then have to understand your own emotions, and then that is the foundation to where we're going to move to, which is social skills. We really want to understand our own emotions, so then we can understand others and then have empathy and really interact and connect on how we're feeling and what that has meant for us. In amongst all of this for emotional regulation as well, there's so much to this as well. So again, recommendation, if there's any concerns, contact us as OTs to support you through this, because your band of arousal and where you're feeling most alert and engaged and attentive is different for everyone. So sometimes your band of arousal might be quite broad, which means you have more flexibility and adaptability throughout the day, or it might be quite narrow and your ability to cope is quite limited, and then you overshoot and behaviors become apparent because they're just not coping. So being able to understand what's going on for your child emotionally is foundational to be able to cope in such a busy environment such as a school classroom and playground, which is where the sensory systems and emotion kind of link here. Okay. So as sensory processing and emotional regulation are foundations to all development, you can see that social skill development then comes on top of emotional regulation. And this is where if you can understand your own emotions, you understand others and that they're separate to you, then means you can start to develop those play skills and exploring through different activities. And, it starts from parallel play and then progresses on from this and interacting with peers. So when we're transitioning into school, we really want to be exploring and playing with imaginative play, being creative during movements or while you're outside or reading books with Andrea. You can be quite creative in what you're seeing and exploring options. And it's the same with exploring play themes, so going to space, being on a farm, and then being able to then negotiate and have a back and forth engagement on how we're going to play a game. So developing rules, being able to cope with winning and losing. So these are all just different skills that we kind of need as we're transitioning into school to engage with our peers. So being able to provide these skills for the kids prior to practice and having all of this repetition and positive reinforcement of negotiation is very valuable for our kids as we're transitioning into school. What I love about those three concepts that we've just spoken about is that you can do it through anything. So you can do it through gross motor play, fine motor, you can do it through reading books and communicating. So it doesn't matter how or when, you can kind of incorporate all of this in together just with one activity. And that's what I love about the transference from speech to OT. And then particularly when we're going to look at movement. So from a gross motor perspective, you can see here that there is some different little checklist pointers that I have that we want to be looking at when we're transitioning to school. And one of the main ones, or the main two that I really like to point out is being able to balance. Can you balance on one leg for 10 seconds? Can you hold your body still and stabilize really strongly to do that? That is quite uncommon for our kids at the moment. And that feeds into postural control, postural strength for endurance and attention to sit and complete an activity. So there's correlations there around postural stability and balance and control to then being able to sit and attend for an extended period of time. So there's those correlations, but then being able to hop, run, skip, jump, all of these different activities at the moment is what we would be expecting to transition into school. So again, everybody learns differently, but just having repetition, practice, and exposure is going to be highly beneficial for our kids transitioning. One of my two favorite things to do is you can create this through obstacle courses. I know last year we had all over social media, we had all the chalk obstacle courses on the driveways as we all were going through COVID. So there's so many different ideas and ways of moving your body online that you can incorporate into your home, or you can even use like your own outdoor or indoor equipment to create obstacle courses and get the kids to come up with it themselves as well, to do the start, middle, and ending of the obstacle course, to explore going over and under and through and using different body parts, leading with different body parts. Are we going to lead with our hands first? Or are our feet going to go first? Are we crawling? I was going to say using our hands, but that's not going to work. Crawling, using our feet, bellies. Don't know why I went to hands. Oh, well, it happened. We're there. But the other thing that I really love to play as well is I love roughhousing. And that is, that it's a fun way to move your body, get postural activities like postural control happening, but then also being able to problem solve. How are you going to get out? How are you going to use your body? How are you going to communicate? It's one of my favorite things to do. And it incorporates so many foundational emotional regulations, social skills, sensory processing, and gross motor development in all of that as well. So there's so many beautiful things that can happen with movement. Again, if we can get out and what we're doing, there's so many different opportunities in our local communities, getting creative with swings at the park, going exploring for a bushwalk or getting into nature. So lots of different options moving forward there. Then we have fine motor skills. And at the end of the day, the teachers aren't really too concerned around your fine motor skills. They want to know from an emotional, social perspective, where are your children at? They can teach these skills. So if your children are not strong fine motor kids that they just avoid, they prefer out playing, that's fine too. Because once they transition to school and they see other children modeling the behavior and what is expected, they're going to be more motivated to engage, and there's going to be clear structures and routines in place. So please don't stress too much about this. However, if you do want to engage in fine motor activities to get the process started, then hey, here's the information too. My biggest things is drawing a person, being able to make sure that you have the head and the body, and then the arms and the legs are in an appropriate spot. That's really the biggest thing that I'd be looking at from a draw a person perspective. It really helps us with body awareness, understanding what our body makeup is, and emotionally, socially has so many other foundations there. So if anything, practice drawing people. And then you'll see here all the different shapes and lines to engage in. So circles, squares, triangles, diamonds, and you can see vertical and horizontal lines and diagonally. If you can complete all of those shapes and be creative with that, they are all prerequisites for handwriting skills. So the kids already know how to draw those shapes. Awesome. They will be able to learn how to write. So there's some few little checklists of if you're going to work on it. Outside of that, craft away. Love it. Tear, rip, squish, glue, paste, cut. Just have fun. Beautiful. And it's just a reminder that all these activities, all these different strategies and skills required is just done through play. So enjoy this time and this quality time that you have with the kids. Play, get creative, explore together before they transition in.
As I said, we don't want you to miss out on the answers and questions from previous sessions. So we will be sending a little PDF with those, because sometimes you don't realize you have a question until someone else asks and you go, oh yes, that was a good one that I had too. So you'll definitely have that information. Jess and I are available via email, and feel free to connect with us on our socials if you need to as well, if you've got any other questions that you don't want to share to the group. But, obviously it's September, your little ones aren't going to be starting till, February. It's often like the second week of the new school term next year. So you've got plenty of time, and we're here to support you, but also connect up with your schools. Often they've got some really nice handouts and information packs and ideas for school readiness.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And everybody, I truly appreciate it. Sing out if you need anything. Thanks, everyone.